Sephardi Zionism, charitable giving, the link between Jews and the land of Israel began with Sephardi Jews and their giving throughout the diaspora to support Jewish life in the land of Israel. It's a practice that today seems commonplace, something we're familiar with from Jews around the world, contributing and supporting Jewish life in the state of Israel. But it's a practice that goes back centuries. It goes back to the famed four holy cities of Israel, which we'll talk about in tonight's lecture. But what's so important about this charitable giving of Sephardi Jews throughout the diaspora to support Jewish life in the land of Israel is that not only did it support life in the land of Israel, but it reoriented diaspora Jewry to look towards the land of Israel in a way that it hadn't been able to do so or hadn't been doing for a millennia beforehand. And so the interest that Jews around the world have in the land of Israel far precedes the establishment of the 19th century nationalist movement that we call Zionism, because it was already Sephardi Jews beginning in the 16th, certainly into the 17th century and 18th century, that were preoccupied with ensuring the vitality and vibrance of Jewish life in the land of Israel. And so in that way, Sephardi charitable giving really changed the Jewish world and put Jews in Israel as a priority for diaspora Jewish communities, and in that way helped to change the course of Jewish history. And so tonight's lecture is Sephardi Zionism and charitable giving. Now, if you haven't already, I ask that you please do subscribe to my channel. Please like today's video. It's a way of ensuring that as wide an audience as possible will be exposed to this lecture. Thank you. Now, the story of Sephardi Jews and charitable giving in the land of Israel begins, as I mentioned, with the four holy cities. Those are the cities of Safed, Tiberias, Jerusalem, and Hebron. Now, many Jewish people think that this is an ancient designation that we have for these cities, that somehow these cities are, shall we say, intrinsically holier than other cities in Israel. And certainly when we think of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem, that's certainly the case. And you could think of perhaps Hebron with the Cave of the Patriarchs. But really this designation, or this, shall we say, packaging, as we'll see, of these four cities together, is actually an invention of Sephardi Jews in the 17th, 18th century. And we'll look at that. But what's important to appreciate is that it's really in those four cities that Jews were living primarily during this pre-modern era. Tiberias was on and off, but the other three cities certainly, and most of them had been in Tzfat, and then in Yerushalayim, and then a smaller community that was in Hebron, in the neighborhood that we refer to as the Avraham Avinu neighborhood. And this is the community that we think of when we talk about the Yishuv HaYashan, right? The old settlement in the land of Israel, right? Which contrasts it with the immigration that will happen in the 19th century of additional Jews to Israel, right? The Zionist movement that will be referred to as the Yishuv HaChadash, right? The new settlement in Israel. Now, the majority of the Jews who were living there, at least originally, were Sephardi Jews, but you do have, beginning in the 18th century, migrations of some Ashkenazi Jews as well. You have the students of the Vilna Gaon, students of the Hasidim, of the Baal Shem Tov, that will settle in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And then you'll have a bit of a diverse community, but the origins and the primary, shall we say, populations, certainly in the 17th into the 18th century, were these Sephardi Jews. The challenge that they faced, despite their, shall we say, original settlement there, kind of their growth in the 16th centuries, was that Ottoman favor towards them decreased, and that ultimately they were suffering from, as a result of increased economic restrictions that had been placed upon them. This resulted in really distressing poverty for these communities that forced them to ultimately be reliant upon donations, upon tzedakah. These were poor communities. On account of the restrictions that they faced, of course, that charity had to be derived from Jews living outside of the land of Israel. And the primary way that that charity was accessed was through shlichim, through messengers. And so the Jewish communities in Israel would send out these shlichim, today kind of in a more Ashkenazi parlance, mishulachim, right, that would go out to various communities around the Mediterranean in order to beseech Jews living in those places, communities in those locations, that they should contribute, that they should help support the life of Jews in the land of Israel, who were largely devoted to the study of Torah and religious practices. Again, their economic life was highly restricted on account of regulations, and so they really were able to focus on spiritual matters, and in a sense, the Jews in diaspora would support them in doing so. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this entire movement of these messengers, there's a great book that I can recommend to you. It's called Emissaries from the Holy Land. It's written by a professor, Matthias Lehman, who's a professor in California. And it's a great book. And if you're interested in it, I'll put a link to it in the description below. And from there, you can access it to read more. Now, there were some famous shlichim that were sent over the centuries. Perhaps the most, shall we say, infamous of all of them was Shabbatai Tzvi, who becomes the false messiah, right, the Sabbatean movement. His story actually begins that he was a messenger, I think, from the community in Yerushalayim, where he went to Egypt in order to raise money from the Jewish community there. Of course, in order to get there, he passed through Gaza, and there he met Nathan of Gaza, and the whole story ultimately developed, right, that he becomes convinced that he is, in fact, Mashiach, the Messiah, and that leads to the sweeping Messianic movement in the 17th century. But the whole reason that he ended up being exposed to a figure like Nathan of Gaza, who had this influence on him, was on account that he was traveling to raise money for the community in Yerushalayim. And that's because oftentimes it was students, young men, perhaps rabbis, that were sent out to raise money on behalf of their communities, often people who maybe were considered to be scholars or people of a degree of renown already, so that they would be more successful in their fundraising activities. And what's interesting is that some of them during their travels actually would spend extensive amounts of time in the communities that they went to, and would effectively actually end up serving as rabbis in those communities. I'll just talk about two of them in this instance. One of them is a rabbi by the name of Raphael Chaim Yitzchak Karijal. And Karijal not only, shall we say, traveled in Europe, he actually made it all the way to the Americas. And he served for a time in Newport, Rhode Island, where he famously befriended Ezra Stiles, who would become president of Yale University. And he actually had his painting of Karijal made, and you can see that painting over here still today at Yale University. He eventually made his way down to Barbados, to the Spanish and Portuguese community there, where he ultimately died, and he's buried there in the Barbados cemetery, and you can visit his grave even until this day. Perhaps the most famous, though, of all of the shlichim in terms of, shall we say, their prominence, their rabbinic stature, as it were, is the Chida, Chaim Yosef David Azulai. The Chida traveled extensively throughout Europe. You can see this map over here of all the places that he went to, including a time in London. And he writes about many of his travels in some of his writings. But he ultimately settles in the large Spanish and Portuguese community in Italy of Livorno. And he serves there for decades. It's actually there that he becomes the teacher to Rafael Meldola, who will eventually become Chacham Meldola, who will serve for decades here in the Spanish and Portuguese community in London. And the Chida, shall we say, entered into this career as a shaliach, but because when he would travel, he would teach and so on, that he ultimately was asked to remain and to serve as the rabbi in Livorno. Now, what's important about these messengers is that, of course, they were there to be fundraisers. And so they needed to convince the people who they were talking to that they should open their wallets and that this would be a good destination for their charitable giving. The Chida famously developed a pitch, as it were, a religious idea to justify why this is how Jews should direct their charitable giving to the Jews in Israel. And what he said was that if you look in the Torah, in the Bible, there is a requirement to give the machatzit hashekel, right? To give the half shekel. This is something we still commemorate with the reading of Shekalim ahead of the festival of Pesach, of Passover. We still maintain the traditions around this by giving additional contributions to synagogues at the times of Purim. There'll often be a plate that will go around to collect money not only for the poor on Purim, but an additional contribution, the half shekel contribution, that will go to the synagogue. And what he argued, what the Chida argued, was that in biblical times, that money was raised ahead of Pesach to pay for the korbanot, to pay for the sacrifices that would be brought in the temple. What the Chida said was that in times when the temple was destroyed, right, nowadays, that Jews still had an obligation to direct their money to the temple, but in a sense, without the temple, that money should be going to the Jews of Israel. And so what he essentially was telling people that is that if they wish to still fulfill the machatzit hashekel, they should contribute to support the lives of Jews in the land of Israel. And so in this way, he, shall we say, elevated the giving to the Jews of Israel beyond simply the mitzvah, the obligation to support, to help Jews who are living in poverty, but gave it an added religious dimension that said that you were doing something even more so, shall we say, religious by helping the Jews in Israel simply because they were living in the land of Israel, and we have a religious obligation because of the machatzit hashekel, because of the Bet HaMikdash, the historic giving, to support Jews who were living in the land of Israel for all time. And so you can see, obviously, the influence that many of these shlichim had through their teaching, through their traveling, through their service in these various diaspora communities. Now, the problem is that some people in the diaspora were starting to get tired of messengers showing up in their communities. Not only would they have to give them funds for their communities back home, but they would also then have to give them funds to take care of them while they were in their town. They would have to give them money to assist them in their travels to the next town. And it started to become something which was a bit burdensome. And so communities in the diaspora began to, shall we say, organize protocols for how they were going to manage these contributions. One thing that many Spanish and Portuguese communities do is they establish a society or a charitable pot of money called Terra Santa, Holy Land. And the Holy Land Fund was designated for giving to the Holy Land. So in a sense, what it was trying to do was to say, don't go to these individual gvirim, right, to these individual wealthy Jews. Simply come to the secretary of this fund, and they will give to the messenger the appropriate amount. In fact, they went even beyond this. They said, you know what? Don't even come. Save the money that was spent on your travels, on the giving, and we will send, shall we say, an annual amount to your communities. And it was a way of, shall we say, trying to reduce the burden. An additional thing that was established was called the Pikidim. The Pikidim were the leaders of the Jewish community in Istanbul, which is, of course, the seat of the Ottoman Empire. And they kind of, shall we say, took it upon themselves to help oversee the administration of this charitable giving. Because not only did you have to somehow get the funds to Israel, so in a sense, it could get directed to Istanbul, and from there it could be distributed, right, dispersed to these communities. But what they also did was to say, instead of giving to Yerushalayim, or giving to Tiberias, or giving to Tzfat, you'll simply give to Israel, and then the Pikidim will break down those contributions based on the populations and the needs of these various communities in Israel, so that the right amount gets allotted to Tzfat, to Yerushalayim, to Hebron, and so on. And in that way, they were trying to streamline the process and ensure the degree of equity in the whole process, to ensure that not everyone was giving to the Jews of Yerushalayim, where maybe they had a smaller population, and then the Jews of Tzfat were, in a sense, suffering because they weren't getting as much giving. These were all efforts to try and maintain a degree of order to what had become a very complicated process. And it's really during this era of the Pikidim, of the organization of these leaders in Istanbul, that you have the development of this idea of the four holy cities. It's essentially a marketing pitch. They take the places where Jews are living in Israel, as we've mentioned, those four cities of Hebron and Yerushalayim and Tiberia and Tzfat, and they say, these are the four holy cities, right? I mean, these are the cities in Israel where Jews live, and they call them the four holy cities. And so in a sense, that becomes the pitch, to support the four holy cities. And so while there may be a historical explanation or association for why these are four holy cities, obviously Yerushalayim, Hebron, Tiberia, again, Rambam is buried there according to tradition, so maybe some association with that. Obviously, Tzfat has the Kabbalists, right? Something we associate with holiness, right? With kadosh, and so there's a reason for it, perhaps, but ultimately that decision to kind of link the four together is not something you find in the Talmud. It's not something you find in ancient Jewish writings. It's a creation of the Pikidim, that instead of contributing to each community individually, you give to the four holy cities. And that becomes an effective fundraising strategy as a way to ensure that the Jews of the diaspora will continue to support all of the Jews living in the four holy cities in the land of Israel. Of course, the Jews in Israel didn't always follow. They felt that perhaps you actually needed a person to show up, that perhaps they could get more donations if someone actually arrived asking for it. And of course, sometimes communities felt that, well, again, if they went and advocated for their specific community, more money could be raised than as opposed to just kind of a general giving for all the Jews of Israel that would then be distributed. It created a degree of complication, as you can see, but it's something that was effective. It lasted for centuries. And most importantly, as I said, it really focused minds on the centrality, on the concern that diaspora Jews had for Jewish life in the land of Israel. And in that way, it ultimately transforms Jewish diaspora consciousness, where instead of communities simply being interested in kind of local affairs, there starts to become an increased focus on Jewish life in Israel and supporting it financially. And you can see how that culture of giving and interest in Israel really, shall we say, ultimately dovetails with the Zionist movement, with Jewish giving. You think of the Jewish National Fund and the various federations and so on that will grow, particularly in the 1900s, to raise money for Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. But this won't be something new. It won't be something that, shall we say, feels artificial, but in a sense will feel like a continuation of this giving that Jews had been doing really for centuries already with great success, and really with a great amount of enthusiasm and sophistication for some time. And in this way, Sephardi charitable giving plays a large role with transforming the orientation and the structure of Jewish consciousness towards Jewish life in the land of Israel, not only conceptually, but ultimately practically in terms of the actual giving that they did. And so this becomes really significant. And so this charitable giving really is a key component of what I'm calling Sephardi Zionism, because it's through the charitable giving that this Sephardi Zionism, this Sephardi care and consciousness and focus on land of Israel really takes and shifts to a practical application. And that is something which is significant, that will have lasting impact on the way that Jews in the diaspora relate to Jewish life in the land of Israel, really even until this very day. And so it's had a huge impact on not only Jewish life in their time, but on contemporary Jewish living as well. And as a result, it really forms a key component of Sephardi Zionism. Thank you.